In the aftermath of the massacres that announced the Armenian genocide, the newly formed Turkish state oversaw an extended phase of looting, expropriating, reinvesting, and destroying Armenian material wealth. Antep-born historian Umit Kurt has shown that, at the very least in the case of Antep, the expropriation of Armenian money, commodities, and real estate was the material foundation for the emergence of a Turkish middle class. While the phase of expropriation has long since been completed, the denialist state's erasure of the material evidence of millennia of Armenian architecture and, more broadly, Armenian history and everyday life continues to this day. In 2013, during my first visit to Mush in modern-day Turkey, historically part of the Western Armenian homeland, I came across the stones of the demolished monastery of Sur Karabet embedded in the walls of houses in the village of Çengeli built on its site. After the genocide, the monastery was reduced to ruins and its stones were repurposed for housing construction. While the monastery no longer exists as a whole, its parts persist incorporated into the walls that hold domestic life. A part of it is also here in New York, or at least was. In 2018, I found the monastery's door in the Armenia exhibition at the Met Museum. This extreme fragmentation and dispersal of the monastery is, in a way, a metaphor for the Armenian diasporic condition and a testimony to the difficulty of comprehending the architectural and urban history of the lost homeland. In Writers of Disasters, philosopher Mark Nishanyan reflects on the impossibility of narrating accounts of the genocide and insists to use the term catastrophe instead of genocide. Analyzing prominent novelist Zabel Yasayan's In the Ruins, a 1909 testimony of the Adana massacres that took the lives of 30,000 Armenians, Nishanyan notes her repeated use of the term ansahmaneli, meaning undefinable. For many Armenians in the diaspora, like myself, it is not only the catastrophe itself that remains undefinable, for unlike Yesayan, we do not have access to the background everyday life of Ottoman Armenia, whose structures of meaning the genocide could so radically undo. The diasporic condition has rendered this life itself ghostly, persistent despite the absence of those minimal conditions of definition and recognizability that might make it mournable. Although one might hope that returning to our ancestral lands might offer an opportunity to encounter what has been lost, the result of nearly a century of spatial erasure is basically unrecognizable Western Armenian landscape. Urban spaces central to my great-grandparents' lives are inaccessible even as memorial objects that I might begin to mourn. What of my more distant ancestors, likely buried in cemeteries whose coordinates I may be able to locate, but which are buried under new construction? The very spaces through which I might connect to their memory have been utterly eradicated. Layers of physicalized denial stand between contemporary Western Armenians and the lost lives and lifestyles we struggle to hold on to. More uncanny are those structures that partially or fully remain, but whose social meaning and function has been fundamentally transformed. They too slip away from recognition, too obscure to mourn. In the time between my first and second visits to Western Armenia, Eastern Turkey, I learned that in the decades following the genocide, survivors in various cities of the diaspora, from Beirut to New York, compiled memorial books, or hushamadyan, in order to preserve the memory of their towns and villages. These collectively produced books preserve Ottoman Armenian everyday life, bringing together diverse information ranging from demographic data and records of political and economic history to everyday narratives, recordings of regional Armenian dialects, family trees, games, recipes, and so on. Many Hushamadians also include maps that display the form and structure of Armenian neighborhoods, towns, and villages, as well as other spatial information. These maps are mostly annotated in Armenian and were often drawn by individuals who had little or no formal education in cartography. For example, the map of the city of Antep shown on the left was drawn by Nerses Barsumian in Aleppo. A few years later, Kevork Barsumian and Garabet Nazarian expanded the map to include not only the Armenian, but also the Jewish, Kurdish, and Turkish quarters. These maps, drawn from memory, represent rare surviving testimonies of Armenian life in the pre-genocide and herbicide period. In some cases, they constitute the earliest cartographic representations of those places. While I had grown up with access to both documentary maps that testify to the reality of the genocide, documenting massacres and deportation routes, as well as the vast archive of official Turkish maps of the territories and cities that make up Western Armenia, these maps are of little use in restoring a sense of pre-genocide Armenian life. The memory maps center what is absent in that dominant map varieties, everyday Armenian life. This map of Sivri Hisar traces the location of every Armenian household against the backdrop of the village's majestic mountains. Reading the work of Sivri Hisar-born Lebanese Armenian poet and survivor Musher Ishkhan takes on a different resonance after encountering the landscape and spatial fabric of his village. Amasya's map highlights a range of cultural, religious, political, and educational sites that structured Armenian life arrayed along the Iris River. Reading that on the Saturday preceding Palm Sunday, Armenian families would go to the banks of the river and return with willow branches takes on new meaning when situated within this mapped landscape. In a text exploring his own family's fragmented history of displacement, historian Harry Harutyunyan draws a distinction between history, the recording of past events within certain chronology based on assumed facts, and something else, the memory of the everyday that he seeks to capture. This distinction is formally reflected in the text structure, because one must accept that, as he puts it, broken lives hinted at by partial memories cannot be made whole by resituating them in the context of a coherent history. A more surrealist method of juxtaposition better fits the material. Collage captures more modestly fractured memory traces and makes no effort to connect them to a structuring storyline. They exist alongside each other. Just as Harutyunyan attempts to reconstruct his family's everyday experience, I'm interested in reconstructing the urban or rural space that made possible the everyday life of Western Armenians. Both the official Turkish denialist maps and the testimonial Armenian genocide maps stand in analogy with Harutyunyan's history, while the Hushamadian maps are on the side of memory and the everyday. We can read them as countermaps that resist denialism, but they are just as opposed to genocide documentary maps as they are to state cartography, in their figuration of space from the perspective of life rather than death. While Harutyunyan uses family photographs, I use maps together with archival and personal photographs and video from my fieldwork in Antap and Urfa. This collage depicts Antap, the vibrant and economically important city still known for its pistachios and apricots, or ziran in Armenian, as annotated and depicted in the map. The city where my great-grandparents lived and studied before fleeing to Aleppo and then to Beirut, where I was born. In the decades following the peak of the genocide, the newly formed Turkish state began to commission planners, including German Hermann Janssen, to develop master plans for major Turkish cities like Ankara and Antap. Janssen's 1935 vision of a modern Antap includes a green belt, arterial avenues, institutional buildings, and clearly defined urban zones, marking out the historical core of the city. While advancing a vision of so-called modernization, his plan enacted a spatial politics of erasure, disfiguring neighborhoods, reconfiguring sites of collective memory, and overriding traces of genocide within the urban fabric. Cemeteries were destroyed or relocated, commercial axes rerouted, and former non-Turkish neighborhoods absorbed into a new Republican urban logic. What was preserved was an emptied-out shell, now represented as anachronistic and pre-modern, in the place of a historic crime. The official urban history of Antap, including the cartographic representations and the revisionist urban memorial plaques that support it, are obstacles to the recovery of Armenian memory and life. The legacy of Janssen-style preservation is to have rendered the Armenian Quarter a Disneyfied tourist fantasy site for imagining a Turkish nationalist past. One can stay in any number of quaintly renovated, formerly Armenian homes for a bed and breakfast taste of old-fashioned Ottoman Turkish everyday life. In fact, I had to stay in one of them. Using the Nazarian Barsumian map, I walked through the streets of the Armenian quarters, trying to understand what it might have meant to move through the city as an Ottoman Armenian. The map allowed me to overlay the perceptual space of the contemporary modern city with a spectral counterspace of Armenian memory, cutting against the layers of destruction, modernization, and Disneyfication that stand between the city I walked and the city my ancestors called home. This map is of the Armenian neighborhood in Urfa, drawn by Zareh Vorperian and Bedros Yeremian in Aleppo. A closer view shows the Armenian church Surp Asvazazin, which, typical of this typology, stood within a courtyard that included a cemetery and was surrounded by educational and communal structures, forming a dense cultural ecosystem. Walking through the streets of Urfa, I was able to locate the church as a structure, but its context has been radically transformed. A newly built road cuts through the courtyard, destroying the cemetery and enabling redevelopment on one side, while the church itself on the other side has been rebranded and is in the process of becoming a state-run museum. No signage or official history acknowledges or reflects this transformation. Only the map reveals it. Moving between memory maps and Google Earth in this way, I began to trace recurring patterns of urban destruction, transformation, and fragmentation. Cemeteries, both in Urfa and Antab, have been erased, building over a gas station in the case of Urfa and a residential block in the case of Antab. Religious and educational hubs in both cities are partially destroyed and fragmented. In Antab, Surp Asvadzadzin, once a central site of communal life, was converted into a mosque, while surrounding schools and homes were demolished to make way for a major roadway, severing the spatial and social fabric of the neighborhood. More broadly, the Armenian Quarter has been reconfigured into a heritage tourism zone. Former homes of prominent Armenian families as well as community buildings have been repurposed as cafes, museums, or left in neglect. While cultural structures such as khans or inns, once vital to local Armenian merchants and economic life, have been stripped of their original function and meaning. Millet Khan, built by the Armenian community and whose yearly profits would in part support community needs, sheltered orphans right before they were transferred to Jbel in Lebanon. Today, like many others, it is a tourist cafe. Countermapping in this way is both an act of witnessing and mourning. I also see this work as the beginning of a contribution to what historian Keith Wattenpaugh has called a regionally embedded comparative approach to genocide in the Middle East that would identify parallels and divergences in the tools of herbicide deployed not only by the Turkish state, but by the agents of genocide and ethnic cleansing in the region, from the UK to Daesh to the US and Israel. But today, I'm more focused on the work as a moment in the process of diasporic Armenian mourning. The juxtaposition of memory map and contemporary city reveals, if only in a fragmentary way, the face of the lost object of Ottoman Armenian life that we must be able to recall and recognize if we are to mourn. Memory and mourning are deeply politicized in this context. On my last day in Antab, I encountered the Barsumian Nazarian map in a strikingly perverse setting. The Panorama 25 Araluk Museum, a denialist institution where a map of early 20th century Antab covers the floor. The Armenian mental map cited among the sources was clearly foundational to its reproduction. Stripped of context and turned against its original intent, this survivor-produced map is mobilized to narrate a nationalist story, one that justifies Armenian dispossession. Even our memories have been turned against us. It is essential in this context to bring suppressed Armenian memory and knowledge to the foreground of urban design history in the region in a way that properly acknowledges the political context from which the memory mapping tradition was born and the ongoing stakes of historical representation of space in a state that continues to deny its foundational genocide and reenacts the urban tools of erasure in Kurdish neighborhoods and cities to this day. Even in the process of coming to know the urban space that fostered the everyday life of my ancestors, I cannot avoid the challenge of, if not preserving this memory against revisionism and denial, at the least mobilizing it in the service of future repair. Hushamadian maps operate as knowledge practices produced from below, embedded in lived experience, memory, and survival. They do not aim for cartographic completeness or scientific neutrality. Instead, they foreground situated knowledge, affect, and everyday spatial practice. Working with these maps requires resisting the impulse to correct or normalize them according to state or disciplinary standards. Their apparent inaccuracies, distortions, and surprising emphases are not failures, but signals, evidence of what mattered in Armenian lived space. Countermapping from the Hushamadian archive is a way to challenge epistemic violence by restoring authorship, context, and intention to survivor produced knowledge. The goal is to reopen the city as a contested archive and to let the ghosts speak through fragments and collages that hold together memory and space, absence and presence, without attempting to heal the wound by closing it into linear continuity. Attending to what remains, honoring what cannot be recovered, and refusing the finality imposed by erasure are the first steps toward repair. Thank you.